Well, to begin our discussion today, we'd like to ask you to imagine 3 different scenarios. And we have a few pictures that will help us to visualize these scenes. In the first picture, we see one of our witness youths in school. And we can see that he's being pressured there by his classmates to engage in a holiday celebration that he knows Jehovah does not approve of. In scenario number 2, we'll see a Christian husband home alone. Perhaps he's there working remotely on his computer when all of a sudden an immoral image pops up on that computer screen. In our last scenario, we see a single sister there in her workplace, and in the background we see one of her co-workers. He's very kind, he's handsome, but he's not one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and he's asking our dear sister out on a date. Thank you for the pictures, brothers. So between all of these 3 situations, what would you say is the common theme? Well, it's simply that each of these situations represents a test of integrity for those brothers and sisters. But what exactly does that mean? What is integrity? Well, we don't hear that word too much in the world today, and when we do hear it, usually it's thought to be synonymous with someone who's honest or trustworthy. And this does give us a sense of that word, but these don't convey the full meaning of the word integrity as used in the Bible. Now, you might be surprised to know that that word integrity, it only occurs in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's derived from a Hebrew word with the root meaning of something that is complete or whole. For example, a form of this word is used to describe the types of animals that would be acceptable sacrifices to Jehovah. These animals had to be complete in the sense that they would be healthy, sound, free from defects. And so when this same word is used to describe humans, it carries that same idea, that of moral soundness or completeness. We could say that word integrity as used in the Bible simply means complete heart devotion to Jehovah. And this understanding helps us to see that for an integrity keeper, their obedience comes from the heart. And it involves not just our actions, but our motivations. And what is the motivation of an integrity keeper? Well, simply, we serve Jehovah because we love him and we fear displeasing him. And so when we serve Jehovah with a complete heart, that means that we'll remain faithful in all areas of our life, regardless of who might be watching. So how do we develop this quality? Well, let's turn in our Bibles to Psalm 119, and there in the first 3 verses, we'll see how we can walk in integrity. There in Psalm 119, starting at verse 1, we read, "Happy are those who are blameless in their way, who walk in the law of Jehovah. Happy are those who observe his reminders, who search for him with all their heart. They practice no unrighteousness, they walk in his ways." So again, in this verse, we see a description of integrity keepers. And did you know in verse 2, it says that these ones search for Jehovah with all their heart. And so that's the first step to walking in integrity, learning what Jehovah requires of us. But then the verses help us to see that we need to then put that in action. Note those action words there in verse 1, walk in the law of Jehovah. Verse 2, observe his reminders. Verse 3, practice no unrighteousness. And the result we see there in verse 3, it says, integrity keepers, when they learn about Jehovah, they apply it. The result is they walk in his ways, or they walk in the way of integrity. Simply, obedience to Jehovah becomes our way of life. Now, speaking realistically, this way of life is a challenge in this sinful world that we live in. As we saw at the outset, we often encounter situations that can test our integrity, and we have to contend with our own imperfections and weaknesses. But isn't it encouraging to see millions of our fellow worshipers of Jehovah who are successfully meeting this challenge? And each of us here in attendance today can do the same. In fact, today we're going to examine a Bible example of an integrity keeper, and this will help us see what we can do individually to keep walking in integrity. So let's find this Bible example. If we turn to Psalm 26, and if you open there to Psalm 26, we're going to come back to this chapter. In fact, this talk is a verse-by-verse discussion of Psalm 26. But there, right at the beginning, we see that this is a psalm of David. So that's whose example we're going to be learning from today, King David of ancient Israel. And note how he describes himself in verse 1. There he says, "Judge me, O Jehovah, for I have walked in my integrity. Jehovah, I have trusted without wavering." Now, as we read these words, what might come to mind is that David was not perfect, right? In the Bible, we read that he committed some very serious sins in his lifetime. And yet he says there, I have walked in integrity. I have trusted in Jehovah without wavering. So is it presumptuous of David to make that claim? Well, no, these words are part of Jehovah's inspired word. That tells us that Jehovah saw David as a man of integrity. But how was that possible when he was sinful? Well, remember what we talked about earlier, that integrity is a quality of the heart. So despite his mistakes, David loved Jehovah. His heart remained devoted to God. And he proved that because when he sinned, he acknowledged his errors, he accepted discipline, and he corrected his ways. So that should be encouraging to us, right? We're all imperfect, we sin, we make mistakes. Perhaps some in attendance have even sinned seriously in their lifetime. But remember, Jehovah can see past our imperfections to our hearts. If our hearts are complete towards Jehovah, then he'll view us as an integrity keeper, just as he did David. Well, now in the rest of Psalm 26, we'll look at specific things that help David to walk in integrity and see how we can imitate him. So let's continue reading in verse 2. There David says, "Examine me, O Jehovah, and put me to the test. Refine my innermost thoughts and my heart." So here we see that David knew that only Jehovah could really see who he was on the inside. His innermost thoughts, his motives, his desires. And then we see he asked Jehovah to examine him and put him to the test. In other words, he wanted Jehovah to help him identify weaknesses within himself that might lead to him compromising his integrity. We could compare that to how the owner of a building or a bridge might hire a civil engineer to evaluate the structural integrity of that structure. That engineer could use a variety of tools to detect internal flaws in the concrete or the steel. And if he does detect some small cracks or weaknesses, well, once he's identified those, the owner can take measures to reinforce those weaknesses. In a similar way, Jehovah tests us in a sense. He might allow situations to develop that can reveal our true motives and our heart condition. Think again to those scenarios that we looked at the outset. We might receive peer pressure or be confronted by an immoral situation. Now, we might not give in to that temptation, but our response could reveal that we have some flaw, some weakness within us. In fact, all of us here today can probably think of situations in our own life that we wish we had handled a little bit differently, right? But remember, regret can be a powerful teacher. So instead of looking backwards and thinking about what we could have done differently in a situation, let's keep our minds on the future, what we can do to shore up those weaknesses. To do this, like David, we pray for Jehovah's help. and then we allow him to refine us through the counsel that we get from his word and organization. And this will strengthen us to continue walking in integrity. Let's go back to Psalm 26 and see what else we can learn from David in verse 3. There David says, "For your loyal love is always in front of me, and I walk in your truth." So here David refers to Jehovah's loyal love. And the Hebrew word that's used here refers to love motivated by a deep, lasting attachment. And David had personal experience with Jehovah's loyal love. In the Bible, we see how Jehovah loyally guarded and protected David when he was being pursued by his enemies. And as we saw, he did not abandon David, even when he sinned seriously. But David had also seen Jehovah's loyal love expressed towards his people Israel. He delivered them, fought for them. He repeatedly forgave them when they sinned. Did you notice in the verse, David said that he kept Jehovah's loyal love in front of him. In other words, he regularly meditated on Jehovah's activity. And this strengthened his love for Jehovah. And as he says at the end of that verse, it strengthened him to continue walking in truth. Now today, we keep Jehovah's loyal love in front of us when we read his word, the Bible, every day. So as we read the Bible, we want to meditate. Think about what those verses teach us about Jehovah. Look for ways that his loyal love affects us personally. See, this strengthens our heart devotion to Jehovah, and it gives us that motivation that we need to continue walking in integrity. Well, let's continue with verses 4 and 5. There David says, "I do not associate with deceitful men, and I avoid those who hide what they are. I hate the company of evil men, and I refuse to associate with the wicked." So in these verses, we see that David was determined to avoid bad association. In fact, he repeats it 4 different ways there in that verse. So why do you think David felt so strongly about the bad effects of unwholesome association? Well, obviously, he knew the effects that bad association could have on his integrity. Now, we don't know for sure exactly when David wrote Psalm 26, but with the content looking back on a life of integrity, its introspective nature, we might assume that it was written towards the end of David's life. And if this was the case, as David wrote these verses about association, he could have been thinking of his son Amnon, who received bad advice from a friend, and that advice led to him raping his half-sister Tamar. And Amnon was actually killed for this by another one of David's sons, Absalom. Then Absalom fled. He lived in exile for 3 years with his grandfather in Geshur. So what effect do you think 3 years of association with pagan royalty would have had on Absalom? Isn't it likely that this bad association strengthened and fed his pride and ambition? So then when Absalom returned to Israel, he actually plotted to usurp the throne of Jehovah's king, even going to the point of trying to kill his own father. Again, we can't say for sure whether or not these events played into David's strong feelings about bad association, but as we see in that verse, David was determined to avoid this pitfall and maintain his integrity. Well, today we know we can't totally avoid associating with everyone who is not a worshiper of Jehovah. But like David, are we determined to avoid any unnecessary association with such ones? Perhaps by spending time with them after work or after school. And while none of us would knowingly keep company with evildoers or wicked ones, might we be associating with such ones through the television shows that we watch or the games that we play on the internet? And then David, too, warned us against the dangers of deceitful men and those who hide what they are. Well, isn't it true that on the internet, often we have no way of knowing who we're interacting with? So like David, we must refuse to associate with anyone online, in the media, in person, whose ungodly thoughts, conduct, attitudes could rub off on us and cause our integrity to be weakened. Well, let's look at what else we can learn from David in verse 6. There in verse 6, David says, "I will wash my hands in innocence, and I will march around your altar, O Jehovah." Now, in ancient Israel, priests at the tabernacle would ceremonially wash their hands with water before ministering at the altar. But now David wasn't a Levite. He couldn't serve at the altar. In fact, even though he was a king, he couldn't even enter the courtyard of the tabernacle. So what exactly was David talking about here? Well, simply, we see in these words reflected his appreciation for Jehovah's arrangement for pure worship. In his mind, he was there at the altar. He delighted in pure worship. And he was determined to remain spiritually and morally clean so that he could continue to worship Jehovah in the tabernacle. Well, today we can say that we march around Jehovah's altar when we exercise faith in Jesus' ransom sacrifice. And this sacrifice is what makes our worship to Jehovah possible. And our appreciation for these provisions moves us as it did David. Note what he says next in verse 7. He says, "To cause the sound of thanksgiving to be heard and to declare all your wonderful works." So here we see that David's appreciation for pure worship moved him to do what? To tell others about Jehovah. And the same is true for us today, isn't it? We declare Jehovah's wonderful works through our public ministry. And staying busy in the ministry strengthens our integrity. It keeps our hope for the future bright. It keeps our faith in God's promises strong. And our ministry also serves as a protection for us. Again, think back to those circumstances that we considered at the beginning of the talk. What a protection it is if our schoolmates and our workmates know that we're one of Jehovah's Witnesses. If we take the opportunity to tell them about our beliefs, if they know our moral standards. Yes, telling others about Jehovah publicly or informally can protect our integrity. Well, now let's look at verse 8 and see another aspect of David's worship that he highlights. There he says, "Jehovah, I love the house where you dwell, place where your glory resides." Now, as we said, at this time, Jehovah's house was the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a center of pure worship for ancient Israel. As we discussed, David loved going to Jehovah's house, and this activity was vital to strengthen his integrity. In the same way today, our Christian meetings, our assemblies, our conventions, they fortify us to continue walking in integrity. And we see this thought highlighted in Hebrews chapter 10 and verses 24 and 25. Please turn there with me. We'll read these words that are familiar to many of us. Hebrews 10, starting with verse 24. There Jehovah commands us, "Let us consider one another so as to incite to love and fine works, not forsaking our meeting together, as some have the custom, but encouraging one another, and all the more so as you see the day drawing near." So again, we see here the Bible command to not forsake the gathering of ourselves together at our Christian meetings. But why is this so important? Well, as these verses show, our Christian meetings are where we incite and encourage one another. Now, isn't it true that we often focus on the effect that our meetings have on us, the encouragement that we receive at the meetings? But as we see in these verses, we should be at least equally concerned with the encouragement that we're imparting to others on these occasions. So how is it that at our meetings we incite one another to love and fine works? Well, we see there at the beginning of verse 24 that we first have to consider one another. And that word consider means to perceive, to understand fully, to consider closely. So that means taking the time to have meaningful conversations with our brothers and sisters, including those that might not be in our immediate close circle of friends. And when we talk to our brothers, we want to draw them out and really listen, not to focus on ourselves and our own problems. So when we consider each other in this way, then we can perceive the needs of our brothers and sisters, and we can see best how to incite them and how to encourage them. And obviously, friends, it's much easier to consider one another when we're here at the Kingdom Hall in person. Now, we know that some are limited by age or illness. They have to tie into the meetings on Zoom, and we need to make special efforts to encourage these ones. But for the rest of us, can we make every effort to be here at the Kingdom Hall in person so we can be part of this interchange of encouragement that will strengthen us to keep walking in integrity? Well, let's change gears a little bit as we go back to Psalm 26. And now in verses 9 and 10, David highlights the danger of failing to maintain our integrity. There, starting in verse 9, he says, "Do not sweep me away with sinners, nor take my life away with violent men. Hands engage in shameful conduct, right hand is full of bribes." So here David highlights how if we allow our integrity to be compromised, this could lead to Jehovah sweeping us away with violent men and sinners at Armageddon. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read these words, sweep away, this reminds me of when I was a kid, and one of my chores was to sweep up the house. So we had one of those kitchens with a yellow linoleum, we had the broom and the dustpan hanging in the basement hallway, and my job was to go around to sweep up that kitchen, under the table, behind the refrigerator, in the corners, and I'd sweep it all into the middle and make a big dust pile. Now, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with what a dust pile is, right? We see it there. A dust pile is full of dirt and dust, hair. I think I even see a Cheerio in there. Now, when you sweep up a dust pile like this, do you take time to pick through it, to maybe see if there's anything in there that could be valuable before you throw it away? Well, no, of course not. That's disgusting, right? Unless something really stands out, we're just going to sweep that whole dust pile away and throw it into the garbage. Thank you for the picture. Well, it's a humorous illustration, but it illustrates a situation that we could find ourselves in if we allow our integrity to be compromised. See, Jehovah would see no difference between us and the rest of the filth of Satan's world. So how can we make sure that we do stand out as different from the violent and immoral people around us? Well, simply, we need to reject the immoral conduct of this world. And today we can say that immoral or shameful conduct is everywhere, right? Immorality is made to appear normal and acceptable in the media, on television, in movies, video games. Pornography is rampant on the internet. And so as we're constantly bombarded by this shameful conduct, we have to keep up our guard in order to protect our integrity. And this is especially true for our young ones. And we have some of you young ones here today in the audience, so we just want to talk to you a moment. We know that you, Christian youths, are special targets of Satan. See, he wants to break your integrity while you're still young and you're still inexperienced. Just like a lion that might try to pick off a young animal when it strays outside of the herd, Satan will focus his attacks on you when you're at school or away from your parents. At school, you young ones, you might be pressured to date at a very early age. You might regularly hear your classmates talking about their sexual activity, their sexual preferences. And if you don't join in, well then we're ridiculed for standing out as different, aren't we? And we know this isn't easy. Nobody wants to stand out. Nobody wants to be ridiculed. But if you're tempted to hide who you are, to blend into Satan's world, remember that illustration of the dust pile. See, we want Jehovah to see a difference between us and the filth of Satan's world. We don't want to risk being swept away by Jehovah with the rest of the sinners in this world at Armageddon. So really, for all of us, young and old, our integrity means our life. When we meditate on that value of maintaining our integrity, our future prospects, if we do keep our integrity, then this will help us cultivate a hatred for all of the corrupting influences that we find in this world. Well, again, friends, as we look around us today, is it not encouraging to see millions of people, young and old, who are continuing to walk in the way of integrity? This way of life is really the ultimate expression of our support for Jehovah's sovereignty. We serve Jehovah because we love him and because we know that he wants what's best for us. So never allow Satan to entice you to do anything that could jeopardize your precious relationship with Jehovah. Now today we've learned a lot from David, but let's look at the last two verses of Psalm 26 for one final lesson. There in verse 11 and 12, David says, "But as for me, I will walk in my integrity. Rescue me and show me favor. My foot is standing on level ground. In the great congregation, I will praise Jehovah." Now, at the beginning of this psalm, we saw that David talked about the past. He said, "I have walked in my integrity." But now at the end of the chapter, we see David is focused on the future. He expresses his firm resolve to keep walking in integrity right down to the end. So let's all of us today imitate David by making this our resolve. If we apply those lessons that we've learned from the 26th Psalm, then we are confident that we can keep walking in integrity right into the new world.